Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're opening a file that I think touches on maybe the single most personal question we can really ask ourselves.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it isn't about, what we do for a living or what we believe or even who we vote for. It's about the actual architecture of us. The core question for today is, are you a statue or are you clay?
Right. It's the fundamental question of identity stability. When you look in the mirror today, are you looking at the exact same psychological entity that was standing there, say, 20 years ago? Or are you looking at a stranger who just happens to share your memories?
Exactly. And usually when we talk about this, we end up with these really vague platitudes. You hear things like, well, people don't change, or on the flip side, life is a journey, man. But today, we are throwing the platitudes out entirely. We're looking at a massive, and I mean massive data set.
Yeah, it's unprecedented.
We are looking at a study that tracked nearly 2,000 human beings for 50 years.
50 years, from the time they were literally teenagers in high school until they hit retirement age. The study is called 16 going on 66, a longitudinal study of personality stability and change across 50 years.
This is the heavy hitter.
It really is the gold standard for this kind of research. It was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. The team was Radhika Damian, Marion Spengler, Brent Roberts, and their colleagues. And the whole mission of our deep dive today is to look at their data and finally answer the question, is personality fixed by age 30? Or is personality actually a form of lifelong learning, like a curriculum that we are all enrolled in, whether we realize it or not?
I love that framing, lifelong learning. And to give this some real stakes, because, 1,795 anonymous data points can feel a little bit abstract.
Yeah.
I will start with a story.
Okay.
It's a love story. But it is also, in my mind, the perfect test case for this exact data. Have you ever heard the story of Jerzy Bilecki and Silas Zabolska?
Is that the Auschwitz escapees? Yeah, I know it. It is a story that sounds like a Hollywood script, but it's entirely real.
It's incredible. So let's just set the scene for the listener. The year is 1943. Poland. Auschwitz. Arguably the darkest, most horrific place on the planet. Jerzy is there. He's a Polish Catholic, imprisoned for resistance activities.
Yeah.
And Sila is there. She is Jewish, and her family has already been murdered. By all logic, they should be focused solely on just surviving the next hour.
Right.
But instead, they find each other. They fall in love.
Which just in itself is a psychological marvel,
Right.
Finding the capacity for that kind of profound human connection in an environment that was explicitly designed to strip you of your humanity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they don't just, hold hands through the fence. They actually plan an escape.
Yeah.
And this isn't a dig a tunnel in the dead of night situation. This is high drama. Jerzy manages to steal an SS uniform.
Wow.
Yeah, he forges a pass. He literally walks up to Sila's block, dressed as a Nazi guard, and marches her out the front gate, pretending she is his prisoner being transferred for interrogation.
The sheer nerve required for that is staggering. And from a psychological standpoint, that tells us something very specific about his personality right there. High risk-taking, extreme dominance, high vigor.
For sure. So they actually get out, they survive, they hide in the woods together. But eventually, the sheer reality of the war forces them to split up just to survive. Jerzy joins the Polish partisans, and Sila goes into hiding with a peasant family.
Yeah.
And they solemnly promise each other that when the war ends, they will find each other again.
But then the chaos of 1945 happens.
The ultimate fog of war. Sila gets told that Jerzy died in combat. Jerzy gets told that Sila fled to Sweden and died there. They mourn, they grieve, and eventually they have to try to move on.
Yeah.
Sila moves to Brooklyn, New York. She marries, she has a kid, builds a life. Jerzy stays in Poland, he becomes a director of a school, and he builds a family of his own.
Two completely parallel lines moving further and further apart for decades.
Until 1983. 39 years later, Sila is in her kitchen in Brooklyn. She's just chatting with her cleaning lady, who happens to be Polish. The cleaner mentions a documentary she saw on Polish TV about a guy, a school director, who escaped Auschwitz with a Jewish girl in 1943.
I can only imagine the shock of hearing that.
Sila just freezes. She gets the cleaner to track down the phone number. She calls Poland. It's Jerzy. He is alive. He has been waiting. And the reunion is set. Sila flies to Krakow. Jerzy is waiting at the airport, and he is holding 39 red roses.
One for every year they were apart.
Exactly.
It is genuinely moving. But I know you, and I know you aren't just telling me this beautiful story to make me cry. You are setting up the scientific question for this deep dive.
I absolutely am, because when I first read that story, I had this overwhelming thought. When they look at each other at that airport terminal nearly 40 years later, were they the same people? Think about it. They fell in love with a very specific person. Jersey fell in love with Sila's spirit, her humor, her resilience at age 20. But now she's 60. Is that same personality still in there? Or did 40 years of living, of a different marriage, of raising kids, of paying bills in Brooklyn versus working in communist Poland, did all that learning rewrite them entirely?
That is the ultimate crux of the nature versus nurture debate, but specifically mapped over time. If you fell in love with the personality in 1943, is it physically and psychologically possible for that exact same personality to exist in 1983?
That is exactly what we're deep diving into today. And the Project Talent study finally gives us the data to answer it. So let's look at the methodology first. Because you emphasized earlier that this study is incredibly unique. Why is that?
It comes down to scale and duration. Like, most psychological studies are done on college undergraduates, mostly because they are cheap, they are on campus, and they are available.
Right, the classic Psychology 101 requirement.
Exactly. So those studies last a semester, maybe a few years if you're lucky. In our field, a quote-unquote longitudinal study usually means we followed people for 5 or 10 years.
And this one is 50.
50 years, half a century. It started way back in 1960. The U.S. government launched what they called Project Talent. They surveyed over 400,000 high school students across America. It was the Sputnik era, the Cold War was heating up, and they basically wanted to catalog the country's human resources.
So picture this. These kids are sitting in a classroom, JFK is about to be elected, there are absolutely no cell phones, and they are filling out these massive paper bubble sheets.
That's the exact environment. Fast forward to 2010, the researchers decide, let's see if we can find these people. Now, obviously, they couldn't track down all 400,000. People move, change names, pass away. But they managed to track down and get complete usable data from a subsample of 1,795 of them.
Which is still a staggering number for a 50-year follow-up.
It is massive. And crucially, they administered the same personality inventory, or at least a highly calibrated version of it that allowed for a direct apples-to-apples comparison across half a century.
Let's talk about that tool, because in 1960, psychology definitely did not use the terms we use today. If you take a test now, you don't see the same words. We didn't have the big five back then.
No, we didn't. Today, if you go to a psychologist or take a validated personality test, you are getting scored on Ocean. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. That is the universally accepted standard map of the human mind right now. But in 1960, the Project Talent Personality Inventory, the PTPI, used 10 different scales with some truly delightful, very vintage names.
I was looking at these in the source material. Some of them sound like they belong in a Jane Austen novel or a Victorian finishing school. Vigor.
Vigor is a great one.
I am feeling quite vigorous today, thank you. So how do the researchers translate 1960s vigor into 2010's modern science?
The researchers had to do a very rigorous mapping process. They demonstrated that vigor, along with sociability and leadership, maps very clearly onto the modern trait of extroversion. If you are vigorous and sociable and you like to lead, you are an extrovert.
Okay, that makes total sense.
Right.
What about calmness?
Calmness and self-confidence map directly to emotional stability. Or, if you want to flip it to the negative end of the spectrum, it's the inverse of neuroticism. So if you scored very low on calmness in 1960, you were highly neurotic.
Got it. Then we have mature personality, which honestly sounds a little judgmental for a scientific test. Like, well, you have a mature personality, unlike some people in this room.
It was definitely a different era of psychology.
Mm-hmm.
But mature personality and another trait they called tidiness both map to conscientiousness. Then there's social sensitivity, which is basically how well you read and care about others' feelings. That maps to agreeableness. And finally, culture, which was their term for the appreciation of arts, ideas, and intellect. That maps perfectly to openness.
Oh, and don't forget impulsiveness.
Right. Impulsiveness maps to low conscientiousness. If you are highly impulsive, you are acting without planning.
Okay, so Damien and her team basically built a Rosetta Stone. They translated the 1960 data into modern concepts.
Mm-hmm.
But as I was reading through the methodology, I saw a potential flaw in the setup, and I want to see how they addressed it. In 1960, these high school kids took a massive test. It was 108 questions. But in 2010, these people are 66 years old. They are retired or busy with grandkids. They aren't going to sit there for 3 hours taking a 108-item test.
You are totally correct. The researchers had to use a short form in 2010, and you are right to flag that as a potential issue. In science, if you change the ruler you are using to measure something, you can't always be sure if the object actually changed size or if your new ruler is just slightly different.
Exactly. So how do they solve the ruler problem?
They ran a validation study first. And this is the sign of really solid, meticulous science. Before they even touched the main longitudinal data from the 1,795 people, they grabbed a completely separate group of nearly 4,000 people, and they had that new group take both the long form and the short form of the test.
Just to see if they match up.
Yes, and they did. The correlations between the long and short forms were in the 0.90s. That is incredibly high. That proves mathematically that the short ruler measures exactly the same psychological constructs as the long ruler. We are definitively comparing apples to apples.
Okay, that is a relief. The methodology holds up beautifully. So now let's get into the actual results, the meat of the deep dive. The study looks at this concept of change in two totally different ways, and I want to make sure we and the listener get this distinction crystal clear because it completely changes how we understand the Jersey and Sila love story. The first way they measure change is called rank order stability.
Right. The best way to think of rank order stability is to use a class reunion metric. Imagine your high school class. Line up all 100 kids in your grade from the absolute loudest to the absolute quietest.
Okay, I have the visual.
Let's say you are number 5 in that line. You are very, very loud.
I was definitely top 10, realistically.
I fully believe that.
Yeah.
So rank order stability asks a specific question. 50 years later at the reunion, if we line everyone up again from loudest to quietest, are you still number 5? Or did you drop down to number 50? Notice that it doesn't matter if the whole group got quieter over time. It only matters where you stand relative to the rest of the pack.
Let me make sure I have this. So if everyone in the entire class takes a vow of silence as they get older, but I am still whispering just slightly louder than everyone else, my rank order is completely preserved.
Exactly. It is entirely about your relative position among your peers. And the finding here is fascinating. Over 50 years, they found a correlation of about 0.23. And when they corrected the math for standard measurement error, it bumped up to 0.31.
Let's parse that number for the listener, because statistics can be dry. A perfect correlation is 1.0. That would mean we are all frozen statues. Everyone is in the exact same order at 66 that they were at 16. A 0.0 means total chaos. Your personality at 16 has zero relationship to your personality at 66. It's totally random. So where does 0.31 sit on that spectrum?
It sits firmly in the moderate zone. It is highly statistically significant. It's definitively not zero. It proves there is what psychologists call a kernel of truth. The person you were at 16 is still mathematically recognizable in the person you are at 66. You haven't been completely overwritten and replaced by an alien.
But 0.31 isn't huge, is it? I feel like if I read a medical study saying my new blood pressure medication had a 0.31 correlation with actually keeping me alive, I would be pretty worried.
That's a fair reaction, but you have to put it in the context of 50 years of human life. Most longitudinal studies only look at 5 or 10 years, and in those short bursts, they see correlations of 0.60 or 0.70, very high stability. But as you stretch the timeline out, the signal naturally degrades. It is like a radio transmission getting further and further away from the tower. There is more static, but the tune itself is still audible beneath the static.
So bringing this back to Jersey and Sila, this means when they finally met at that airport terminal, there was a 0.31 correlation to the exact teenagers they originally fell in love with.
Yes. Jersey likely still had that relative edge of leadership and vigor that made him brave enough to steal an SS uniform in the first place. He was still braver than the average guy his age. Sila likely still had her relative social sensitivity. They weren't strangers to each other.
But why? Why does anything stick at all after 50 years of marriages, careers, tragedies, and triumphs? Why don't we just completely scramble the deck?
The researchers point to 2 main reasons. One is biological. It's the sociogenomic perspective. We all have a genetic baseline. Your baseline temperament, literally how reactive your nervous system is to stimuli that is your hardware. It just hums along in the background your entire life, providing a steady signal.
Right, some babies are just born jumpier than others.
Exactly. And the second reason is the environment. But specifically, it's about environmental consistency. As humans, we curate our own lives. We aren't just passive. If you were a highly bookish intellectual 16-year-old, meaning you had high culture on this test, you probably worked hard to go to college. You probably got a job in a library or a lab or academia. You probably marry someone who also likes to read and debate ideas. You built a physical and social world that constantly reinforces your bookishness.
We basically build the echo chamber that sustains our own personality.
Precisely. We don't just exist in the world randomly. We actively select the specific world that fits us best. And that continuous selection process sustains the stability of our traits.
Okay, so that is the kernel of truth. We stay somewhat the same relative to our peers. But here is where the study really blew my mind. Because while we stay the same relative to others, we change massively in an absolute sense. This brings us to the second metric, mean level change.
Right. Mean level change completely ignores the relative lineup. This metric asks, did the average human being in the entire study change? Did the group as a whole shift their absolute scores up or down?
And the answer to that is what they call the maturity principle.
Yes. And this is really the headline news of the entire study. We do not just change randomly in all directions, we change directionally. As we age, as we learn, we get better.
Define better for me in this context.
Yeah.
Because that sounds subjective.
In evolutionary and psychological terms, better means more adapted to survival and more adapted to social cooperation. We become significantly more conscientious. We become far more emotionally stable. We become substantially more agreeable.
So we basically become the exact people our parents always begged us to be when we were teenagers.
Essentially, yes. We finally learned the lesson. And the data on this is staggering. Let's look at mature personality, which maps to conscientiousness. Over those 50 years, the average score for the entire group increased by 1.64 standard deviations.
Okay, I need you to really contextualize 1.64 standard deviations for me and the listener. Because to a layperson, hearing 1.6 sounds like a tiny marginal shift. Is that actually a lot?
It is absolutely enormous. Just to give you an idea of scale, in clinical psychology, if we do a massive intervention, like, say, 6 months of intensive cognitive behavioral therapy or a major new drug trial, we are literally popping champagne corks if we see an effect size of 0.4 or 0.5. An effect size of 1.64 over a lifespan is transformative. It's paradigm shifting.
Give me a real-world comparison to help visualize that leap.
Think of it in terms of IQ scores, which people are familiar with. One standard deviation in IQ is 15 points. Moving 1.64 standard deviations is the equivalent of taking a person of perfectly average intelligence, an IQ of 100, and magically moving them to an IQ of 125. That sudden leap puts them from the dead center of the bell curve into the top tier of human intelligence. It represents a completely different, vastly superior level of daily functioning.
Wow. So the difference between the average 16-year-old's conscientiousness and the average 66-year-old's is like that IQ jump.
It is the difference between a chaotic, profoundly messy bedroom with undone homework shoved under the bed and a person who has calmly filed their taxes a month early for 20 consecutive years. It is a fundamental rewiring of how you handle responsibility and duty.
That is wild. What about the other traits? What about calmness?
Calmness increased by over 1 full standard deviation, 1.07 to be exact. We get much, much less neurotic and anxious. Social sensitivity, which is our empathy, increased by 1.12 standard deviations. We learn to be much kinder and more attuned to others.
This really destroys that pop culture trope of the grumpy old man, doesn't it?
It severely complicates it. We might get a bit more set in our routines, but on the inside, we're generally much more emotionally stable, forgiving, and empathetic than we ever were as teenagers. The angst-ridden, volatile teen is a statistical reality. But the calm, wise senior citizen is the direct result of 50 solid years of lifelong learning.
I'm glad you brought up the word learning again, because I want to really drill down on that focus. For a long time, the field of psychology pushed this thing called set point theory, the idea that human beings are essentially rubber bands.
Right. Set point theory dominated for a while. It says that life happens to you, you get a big promotion, you stretch and get really happy. Or you get fired, you stretch the other way and get sad or anxious. But eventually, the tension releases and you always snap back to your genetic baseline. If set point theory were actually true across a lifespan, we would absolutely not see a 1.64 standard deviation shift. We would see 66-year-olds snapping right back to their disorganized teenage selves.
But the data says we don't snap back. Instead of rubber bands, we see plasticity.
We see clay. Life shakes us, and crucially, we hold that new shape. And then life shapes us again, and we hold that. It accumulates. The researchers in this study strongly argue that personality development is fundamentally a form of lifelong learning. We aren't just biologically aging, like our hair turning gray. We are actively learning how to be a functional human. We touch the hot stove of being highly impulsive. We get burned by the bad consequences, so we learn to stop doing it. We learn that being kind and agreeable smooths over conflict at work, so we practice it until we simply become kinder people.
So jumping back to Jersey and Sila, when they met at that airport, yes, they had the kernel of truth, the rank order stability. But in an absolute sense, they were radically different people.
They were undoubtedly much calmer, much more patient, much less prone to reckless impulsivity. Think about it. If two 20-year-olds tried to navigate that incredibly complex, emotionally explosive reunion after 40 years apart, with other marriages and whole other lives involved, it might have completely imploded. There would be jealousy, volatile misunderstandings, high drama. But two 66-year-olds, they had acquired the emotional tools. They had literally learned the mature personality required to handle that gracefully.
So the decades they spent apart actually gave them the psychological tools they needed to reunite successfully. That is a really beautiful thought.
It really is. The plasticity of their personalities is what saved them in the end.
But I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. We're talking heavily about averages. On average, people get better. But I think everyone listening knows at least one person who is 60 years old and is still acting exactly like they are 16. They're still terribly impulsive. They're constantly making messes. They thrive on drama. How does this study account for the people who refuse to learn the curriculum?
You are exactly right to point that out. Averages hide the individual details, and that's exactly why the study didn't just stop at the group average. They also calculated individual level change. To do this, they used a very strict statistical tool called the Reliable Change Index, or RCI.
I saw that in the paper. This is basically the is it real or is it noise metric?
Correct. The RCI filters out all the random noise. It asks a mathematical question. Did this one specific person change so much on this trait that we can be 95% certain it wasn't just a temporary mood swing, or they were tired that day, or they made a mistake filling out the bubble sheet?
And what did the RCI reveal?
It revealed that 97.9% of the people in the study showed reliable, verified change on at least one of the 10 traits.
Wow. So only about 2% of the population are actually statues.
Basically, yes. Total across-the-board stagnation is a myth. It's an extreme exception. And it goes further. Almost 60% of people showed reliable change on 4 or more traits. This transformation is pervasive. But here's the kicker that explains your immature friend example. While the average person goes up in maturity, not every single individual does.
So some people actually slide backward. They unlearn.
Some slide backward, or they just stay completely flat while everyone else grows. Take mature personality again. About 60% of people changed significantly on that trait, and the vast majority of those went up. But that still leaves 40% of people who did not change significantly on that specific trait over 50 years.
What about the other traits? I read that leadership was the most sticky, the most stubborn trait.
Yes. Only about 21% of people change their leadership or dominance scores significantly. This implies that if you are a quiet follower at 16, you are highly likely to be a quiet follower at 66. If you are the bossy kid at 16, you are likely the boss at 66. That specific trait seems to be much more hardwired into our sociogenomic baseline than something like tidiness.
That makes intuitive sense to me. Dominance feels more like a raw temperament thing, tied to your nervous system.
Right.
Whereas tidiness feels like a learned habit. You can learn to put your shoes away, but it's much harder to learn to naturally want to command a room.
Exactly. The learning curve is different for different traits.
I want to pivot to something really technical but absolutely fascinating that the researchers highlighted. It's called profile stability, and it leads into something they call the normativeness problem. Now, I have to say, the normativeness problem sounds like the title of a dystopian sci-fi novel.
It really does sound ominous, but it's actually deeply related to mental health and social functioning. So far, we have been looking at traits in isolation. We've asked, how did your calmness change, or how did your vigor change? Profile stability is a person-centered approach. It looks at the whole you, the entire constellation of all 10 traits at once.
Like looking at the whole recipe instead of just measuring the flour. A pinch of vigor, a cup of culture, a spoonful of neuroticism.
Right. And the question is, does your unique recipe stay the same relative to itself? The study found an overall profile stability of 0.37. So again, the general recipe of who you are remains somewhat recognizable. But here is the massive paradox they discovered. As we age, as we go through this 50-year curriculum, we all become more normative.
What does normative actually mean in this specific psychological context?
It means average, but average in a very highly adapted, healthy way. The statistically normative personality profile across the whole human population is high conscientiousness, high agreeableness, high emotional stability. It is basically the exact profile of a really good citizen.
A highly functioning, low-drama adult.
Yes. And because we are all collectively learning how to be functioning adults, because the curriculum of life pushes all of us toward that exact same goal of survival and cooperation, our profiles start to look more and more like each other.
We converge.
We converge. The normativeness score of the group went from 0.51 at age 16 up to 0.62 at age 66. We are all becoming increasingly similar to the ideal human template. But here is the rub, the problem part of the normativeness problem. If you computationally strip away that normative change, if you subtract the fact that we all learn to pay our taxes on time and be polite to the barista, and you look only at the distinctive parts of our personality.
You mean the quirks, the specific weird things that make me, me, and not you.
Exactly. Once you isolate just the distinctive quirks, the stability of those quirks drops to 0.17.
Whoa. 0.17 is basically approaching 0. That is almost random.
It's extremely low. This suggests a profound truth about getting older. The things that make us highly weird or unique as teenagers are actually the most fundamentally unstable parts of our identity. As we learn to live in the world, we systematically sand those quirks down. We smooth out our own rough edges so we can fit into the social contract.
I have to admit that is kind of sad. It sounds like we slowly lose our spark, our individuality, just to blend in.
You can look at it that way, but clinically we view it as losing our maladaptive behaviors. Being a brilliant, tortured artist who is highly volatile, constantly angry, and can't hold down a job that is a very distinctive profile, you will definitely stand out. But it's usually not a happy or long life. Learning to become a functional artist who actually pays rent and maintains relationships means you became much more normative. You became more boring, statistically speaking, but you almost certainly became happier and healthier.
So we basically trade our chaotic uniqueness for functional competence.
In a way, yes. We trade chaos for competence and isolation for connection.
I guess when you frame it like that, I can live with that trade.
Ah.
Now, we have to talk about the massive elephant in the room regarding this specific data set. We are talking about kids who were 16 in 1960, the Mad Men era. The cultural landscape was incredibly, deeply segregated by gender. The expectations for men and women were fundamentally different.
Hugely different. Different planets, socially.
Right. So if personality development is largely learned from the environment, and men and women in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s had totally different environmental curriculums. Men being pushed into the cutthroat office, women largely being pushed toward domestic roles or different career tracks. You would logically expect their personalities to evolve in completely different directions, right?
That is the exact hypothesis most sociologists would make. You would expect the women in this cohort who literally lived through the second wave feminist revolution, who entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers in the 70s and 80s, to show a radically different trajectory of change than the men who were maintaining the status quo.
What did the data actually say?
The data said unequivocally no.
Really? No difference?
Really. Men and women changed at almost exactly the same rate and in the exact same directions. Rank order stability. It was 0.21 for women and 0.20 for men. Identical. Mean level change. The patterns of maturation are identical. Both genders shot up in conscientiousness, both shot up in calmness, both shot up in agreeableness. The lines on the graph move in perfect parallel.
So the radically shifting gender roles of the late 20th century didn't warp the learning curve at all.
They did not affect the slope of the curve. What gender did affect was the starting point, the baseline. In 1960, the 16-year-old girls were already scoring significantly higher on mature personality, tidiness, and social sensitivity.
I mean, anyone who has ever spent 10 minutes in a middle school knows that is true. The girls are organizing the student council bake sale with clipboards, and the boys are out back throwing mud at a wall.
The scientific data firmly confirms your anecdotal observation. The girls started higher, and when they measured them again at age 66, the women were still higher in those exact same areas. The gap between men and women didn't close, but it also didn't widen. Both genders just moved up the maturity ladder in parallel lockstep.
Were there absolutely any exceptions to that rule? Any places where they diverged?
Just two relatively small ones. Over the 50 years, men increased slightly more in self-confidence than women did, and women increased slightly more in social sensitivity than men did.
So men got a little bit more aggressively confident, and women got a little bit more deeply empathetic.
Which does suggest that society pushed them slightly into those respective corners. But the big picture, the fundamental machinery of maturation is human, not gendered. We all face the core curriculum of life. We all face aging parents, raising children, holding down jobs, dealing with loss, facing our own mortality. And that universal human curriculum teaches us all the exact same lessons about how to behave.
That is profound. Okay, so we established the what, the fact that we change massively, and we've established the who, basically everyone, regardless of gender. Let's finally talk about the how. How does this clay actually get sculpted?
Yeah.
You mentioned the curriculum of life. The leading theory the researchers point to is called the social investment principle.
Yes, this is the mechanism behind the learning. We don't just mature passively because of biology, the way a teenager grows wisdom teeth or gets taller. We mature actively because we invest our identities into social roles.
Give me a concrete example of how a role changes a trait.
Let's look at parenting. You become a parent. Suddenly, you are handed a screaming, helpless infant. That new role absolutely demands patience. It demands extreme selflessness. It demands hypervigilance. Now, you might not be a naturally patient or vigilant person. Your genetic baseline might be highly impulsive. But you are forced to act patient to keep the child alive. So you act patient. You suppress your impulses, and you do that every single day for 18 years.
And eventually the mask just becomes the face.
Exactly. The required behavior becomes deeply internalized. The same goes for work. You become an employee. The job demands punctuality and tidiness. You force yourself to set an alarm and be on time. You do that for 40 years, and you literally become a punctual, conscientious person.
So the old cliche, fake it till you make it, isn't just cheap self-help advice. It's an actual documented neurological reshaping process.
It is the foundation of personality development. And the study even briefly touches on the concept of epigenetics to explain how deep this goes. Now, this part is speculative, but it's where the field is heading. The idea is that these repetitive experiences, these demanding social roles we invest in, might actually flip chemical switches on our DNA, changing how our genes are expressed over time. So the outside environment literally gets under our skin and alters our biology.
This brings me to what I think is the most empowering part of this entire deep dive. If personality is fundamentally learned, if it is the cumulative result of the roles we play in the environment we choose, then it means we actually have a choice in the matter.
We absolutely do.
We can choose the curriculum we enroll in.
That is the ultimate practical takeaway from this 50-year data set. If you are listening to this and you feel stuck, if you catch yourself thinking, well, I'm just a hopelessly disorganized person, or I'm just naturally too anxious to do this, this massive study mathematically proves you are wrong. You are not a fixed object. You are an ongoing process.
So if I decide tomorrow that I want to be a more conscientious person, I shouldn't just sit alone in my room and try to use sheer willpower to think myself into being better. I should intentionally go out and take on a role that forces me to be better.
Yes, exactly. Join a board of directors for a local charity. Volunteer for a leadership position at work that has real responsibilities and deadlines. Sign up for a rigorous class. Put yourself in a binding social structure that actively demands the exact trait you want to cultivate. You let the environment do the heavy lifting of shaping your habits.
Don't rely on willpower. Rely on role power.
Precisely. You can consciously accelerate your own maturity curve. You don't have to just passively wait around for 50 years hoping life teaches you the right lessons by accident. You can enroll in the advanced class on purpose.
That brings us right back to Jersey and Sila. They didn't choose their role in 1943. The horrors of the war forced an incredibly brutal role on them. Survivor, resistance fighter, escapee.
And that extreme role shaped them. It likely made them far tougher, more hypervigilant, more resilient than they ever would have been otherwise.
But then they survived. And the long peace that followed forced totally new roles on them. Immigrant, parent, school director, Brooklynite. And those roles shaped them all over again. They made him softer, more stable, more normative.
So when they finally met in that airport in 1983, they weren't just two teenagers frozen in amber. They were the sum total of all those incredible roles they had played over 40 years. They were masterpieces of human plasticity.
I think that is honestly the most hopeful thing I have heard in a really long time. It means that redemption and growth are literally baked into the human experience. We aren't doomed to forever be the mistakes we made when we were 20.
We aren't. We are biologically and psychologically designed to outgrow them.
So here is my final provocative thought for you, the listener. You might be driving your car right now, or doing the dishes, or walking the dog, just thinking about who you are. And you might not like some parts of yourself. You might feel like that statue carved in cold stone a long time ago.
But the data definitively says you are clay.
The data says you are clay, and the sculpting is far from over. The 16-year-old version of you would probably be amazed at the person you are today. And the 66-year-old you or the 86-year-old you is currently waiting to meet you. And because of the maturity principle, because of lifelong learning, they're going to be even better.
Just keep learning.
Thank you to the brilliant researchers at Project Talent and Rod Academian's team for this incredible, unprecedented work. Thank you to our expert for walking us through the weeds of the data. And most importantly, thank you for listening and learning with us on the Deep Dive. We will see you next time.